We're now going to have a look at PHP attributes, something which was introduced in version 8 of the language, and they are a tool for adding metadata to classes, methods, properties, functions, and even parameters. I'll go over a couple of uses which already exist of attributes, because you may have seen the syntax but not really fully understood them, and then we'll have a little example of our own. Here is one fairly common use which you may or may not have seen. I'm on the Symfony documentation as it happens, and we're just looking at a controller here, and this is the attribute syntax. So here what they are doing is they're using an attribute called route to actually say that anything, any traffic to this application which goes to this blog endpoint will actually get diverted to this list method on the blog controller. So it's actually reading the information from this attribute and taking that in order to actually direct it to where the request needs to go. And an important thing to know about attributes here is that this route attribute is just providing metadata. Another part of the application of the PHP can actually read this metadata and know what to do with the information. But you tend to keep the attributes fairly light on functionality. So the actual attribute won't be doing much, but it will be holding the information which is needed in order for the other parts of the application to route that request to this method. Let's have a look at another one. This time we're in Doctrine ORM, and we're looking at the documentation for creating a product object. And so this is something which will be mapped to a database. So you'll have product objects which map to a products table in the database. And in order to do that mapping, again, we are using attributes. And again, this just contains metadata. So as you can see here, it's saying that this entity here, this attribute is a table attribute. And it's saying that we are going to map to the products table. And so that is applied to the product class. And then doing very similar thing here, we are just attributing these values to this ID property. And so saying in the database, this will be of integer type. It will be an automatically generated value. So again, just using metadata, no functionality or very light touch functionality inside of attributes. It's more something to read, grab the value from, and then do something with it in other parts of the code. So something which I should mention is that for the examples that I've just shown you in the past, what Doctrine and Symfony would have used would have been annotations, but attributes are much better for several reasons really. Native support, so annotations in PHP sort of relied on doc block comments and third-party libraries to parse and extract the data, but attributes are natively supported in PHP and so provide a much more standardized approach, which is much more consistent. The metadata is structured. It's better for performance because parsing dot blocks at runtime, especially in larger projects, could lead to performance overhead. Better for refactoring safety, better for explicitness, and just in general better tooling. So essentially, attributes enable a declarative approach to programming where we can describe what something is or how it should behave without actually muddying our code with extra details. If you enjoy this recording and you want to learn more object-oriented PHP with me, then be sure to check out my Learn Object-Oriented PHP course over at garyclarke.tech. Details at the end of the video and also in the description. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to have a data transfer object which will hold some data that we want to persist to the database. But before we do that, what we want to do is actually validate the data on that data transfer object. And for that, we are going to use attributes. And so the first thing we're going to do in this one is we're going to actually create that data transfer object. But first, a little bit of project setup. I'm in a brand new project. All I've got so far in this project is a git ignore file, and that is just to ignore some stuff which comes from like JetBrains, PHP Storm, and also I'm ignoring a vendor folder which we haven't created yet, and just a couple of other bits. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to require a library, and so in doing that, by Composer requiring a library, it's going to do multiple things. First, it will pull in that library for me, but it will also initialize Composer for me, and that means that I'll have auto loading out of the box. So this is a good way to start a project in a way which I normally start, and it's usually with a debugging tool or something which I know I'm going to use in that project. And I use similar kind of tools in all projects, and so the one I'm looking for here is going to be Symfony Vardumper. So I'm going to say Composer require, and this is going to be a debugging tool, i.e. a development tool. So I only want it in my dev environment, and so I say -dev Composer require -dev, and it's going to be Symfony /Vardumper DUMPER. Okay, so once that is pulled in, you'll notice some changes to the project. I now have a vendor folder, and inside there I have the Symfony Vardumper package, but importantly I have my auto loading. That also created a Composer JSON file, and if we have a look at that, we have one entry here, and that is to require as a dev dependency the Symfony Vardumper package. Okay, and I've just bumped the font up a little bit there for you. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set up our auto loading. So what I want to do here is I want to have a folder called source src, but I want to actually map the namespace app to that folder so that anything which goes into the source folder starts with the top level namespace of app. And the way that you do that is like this. So first off, you need to tell Composer that we are looking at auto loading here. I want a specific kind of auto loading, and that is PSR4. So I've already covered this earlier in the Composer section, the auto loading section, but if you want to refresh yourself on that, just go and check that out. And then we need to do our mapping. And so here we're going to say app, and you need to say //. So that is your namespace, followed by the actual folder, the top level folder for that namespace, and this will be src. I'm getting some squiggly underlining here because that doesn't exist. On Mac, if I hit Alt and then Enter, it pulls up this menu to say it can create this folder for me. So we might as well do that. I'll just hit Enter there, and as you can see, I now have this source folder. If you're not using PHP Storm, if you're using something else, then just go and manually create that folder in the top level of the project. Okay, but we're not finished there, because any time where you make any kind of adjustment to your auto loading setup, you need to tell Composer about it. And the way that you do this is by saying Composer and then dump-auto load. But let me show you a different way of doing that, a shorter way, which someone showed me on one of my courses. I can just say Composer du, and it will do the exact same thing, and there it has now generated my auto loading files. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our data transfer objects. So I suppose I should explain to you what these are. This isn't anything massively technical or highbrow or anything like that. It's simply a vehicle, and so the best way for me to explain it is how we are going to use this in our scenario. In this scenario, what we would be doing is submitting a form, and so what the DTO would do, it would temporarily hold the values from that form, and then another component or another process can go and read the values on that DTO, on the data transfer object, and persist them to the database. So it's simply a way of storing and holding data while you are moving a process from one place to another. Simple as that. And so for that reason, DTOs tend to be fairly simple things. It'll just be some data and maybe methods for transferring the data in one format to another format sometimes. But for us, all we're going to use it for is just to actually hold that data, which will be a username and an email as if submitted from a form. So I'm going to call this user registration. The namespace will be app /DTO. It must match the folder structure. That's how PSR4 works. So if you notice, we're using app, which we know is already mapping to source, and then the name of the next layer of the namespace maps to the actual folder name, and that is how PSR knows how to find things. Let's click OK. And then we're just going to go and add the properties to this class. So we can use promoted properties. We can do this all in the constructor, and they will be username and email. So public string email, or we'll go username first, and public string email. And you may be looking at this and thinking, why have I used public here? Why have I not used private to protect these properties? And we're going to talk about this in the next one, where we'll speak about read-only properties and read-only classes. At the end of the last one, we had a look at our constructor and our properties, and we asked the question, why have we made these public? Why not make them private and then they can't be mutated? And so that is an option, but I think we can take advantage of something called the read-only keyword, which was introduced in PHP maybe 8.1. And what that does is you tend to use it on properties like these, where when you're instantiating the object, by making them read-only, it means that they cannot then be altered. So the object is immutable, or certainly those properties which you annotate as read-only are immutable. We'll have a demonstration of it in a second, but first of all, let me show you how you do this. So here we're going to say read-only public string username. I will do the same for email. So we'll say read-only public string email. And so that means, like I say, once this object has been created, then those properties cannot change. Let's demo this. So the way we'll do this is I'll go and create an attributes.php file at the very top level, where we can just use it to play around with this stuff. The first thing we'll do is we'll make sure we've got our auto loadings. So require once vendor /auto load. And then we shall instantiate a user registration DTO. So I'm just going to import that, and very simple, it's just like any other constructor. Absolutely nothing else is different about the way you do this. Okay, so there we've instantiated a user registration. We've provided it with the properties or some values which it expects. Let's just dump this out and see what it looks like. So I can say PHP and then attributes, which is the name of the file. I'm at the very top level of the project here in my terminal. And so there we see our user registration with those two properties. Now they are public properties, and up to now we've been able to access public properties and alter them. For example, if I wanted to change the email to info@example, this is what I would have been able to do. What do you suppose will happen if we try this now? Let's go and run this. Okay, and so we get a fatal error. Uncaught error, cannot modify read-only property, user registration, email. So this is immutable. I can't actually change it now. Even though it is public, it's been declared public, it's also been declared read-only, i.e. it can only be set at instantiation time when this object is created. After that, it is immutable. Let's move on to the next thing we can do with this. So you'll notice the user registration has this squiggly line underneath it here. And basically what PHP Storm is trying to tell me is that I can make the class read-only, because we've made every single property on this read-only. Why not just make the entire class read-only? And we can do that by saying read-only class. And then that means that these become redundant. By saying read-only class like so, it means you are making every single property on that class a read-only property. Okay, and so this should work the same now. Let's have a look. We're trying to set this email. We've made every property read-only. So if I go and run this, we get the same thing. I'm trying to modify a read-only property email. And that is how read-only works. For our scenario, it's perfect, because when we create this DTO, we don't want these values to change. We're just going to store them here. And DTOs are classed as a type of value objects, and on value objects, then the values don't actually change. If you did want to have new values, then what you would have to do was create an entirely new user registration DTO and populate it with those new values. We're now in a position where we can go ahead and create our first custom attribute. So let's think about what we decided this attribute is going to do. It's going to represent a rule, a validation rule. So I think a good place to put this will be inside of source, and then inside of there we'll create a new folder called validation, and then this is going to represent a rule which will say required, so i.e. the username is required or the email is required. So let's go and create another folder inside of validation called rules, and then we want the name of the rules. So very simple, we're just going to create a class, and this is what attributes are. They are just classes, except you decorate them with a particular kind of markup, which I'll show you shortly. So required, then we need to think about the namespace here, don't we? So this is going to be app, and then validation, and then rules. Okay, and then the way that we make this an attribute is we use this syntax here. We use a hash or pound sign or whatever you call it in your country, followed by square brackets, and then attribute. And so by doing this, I'm just going to import this. And so by doing this, we have now made this class an attribute, and we'll be able to apply it in the various different places where you are able to apply attributes. And so that is what we'll have a look at in the next one. We now have our custom attributes, so let's take this and go and apply it. So if we go and look for our user registration, we said we wanted to apply this to the properties, but there's a number of places, different places where you can apply attributes. Let me list those for you now. They can be applied on classes as well as anonymous classes, properties and constants, methods and functions, as well as closures, and they can be used as method and function parameters. So you could do something like this. You could apply it to a class like so, required, but we're not going to apply it there, of course. We want to apply this only to the properties to say that they are required. So I can drop it just above here, or you could actually inline it here like so. Not sure what the official way or supposed best way of doing it is, but I kind of like that. If I'm doing it that wrong, let me know. And then I'll drop another one here because I want the username to be required, and I also want the email to be required. And so at the moment, okay, this looks good. If you were just using it for metadata, this would be fine, you know, or just to show developers which properties are required. But at the moment, on its own, these won't actually do anything. You'd be able to use reflection to show that these attributes have been applied to these properties, but no validation is actually going to take place. We still need a little bit more work to do in order to actually make these meaningful and to be able to use them in a useful way. So we'll start to have a look at that in the next one. Okay, so we need to start to think about how we're going to actually validate the properties on our user registration DTO. So I think what we're going to do here is we'll go over to the attributes.php, and I'll show you a way that I tend to like to work, and that is to sort of write the client code first and then write the actual real code. So what I mean by that is to put in the code, how you'd like it to look, how you'd like it to work, and then go and actually add it for real and make it work. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'd like to have something like this, like a validation mechanism, so a validator component or a validator class. And so I can do validator equals new validator. Obviously this class doesn't exist yet, but this is just how I do things. So I'll just think about what would be nice code to work with for the developers come to use this. And so we say validator equals new validator, and then we can say validator and validate, and then pass in the actual object which you want to validate. So in our case, that will be user registration. I'm just going to get rid of this stuff here, and then it will be nice to actually be able to retrieve any of the errors. So once you've passed this in here and you've called validate, what will be good, we'll be able to just say, okay, here are the errors. So then you can say errors equals validator get errors. So again, that class doesn't exist, these methods don't exist, but this is how I'd like it to work. So simply 3 steps there. You instantiate your validator class, you pass in the object to a validate method, and then that will do what it needs to do and generate any errors. So for example, if the username or the email don't validate correctly, if we don't provide the values that it's expecting, then that will get added to an errors array. So what I'm going to do here while we're on this page is I'm just going to make these values into values which would fail validation. So if you were checking if something's required, or if we were checking to see if something is a real email, then I can just say not an email and make these obviously fake, or make them obviously values which should fail validation. And so once I've written the client code in the way that I'd like the actual components to work, then I work backwards and I go and actually create them for real. So I think in here, we've already got a validation folder. So I think at the top level in there, I can actually put my validator class. The namespace is correct. Okay, we said this is going to have 2 methods, validate and get errors. So validate, this will take an object. I know that's pretty loose, but it could be all kinds of different classes at the moment, and I've not decided I'm going to make it specifically for DTOs or anything like that. So we'll just stick with object for the time being. Don't want this to return anything, so this is like a command. So we're just saying validate, we're not saying get this or get that. And so for that reason, we're going to say void. You could return the errors from here, but then it's doing 2 things really. It's doing validation and then it's acting as a getter to retrieve errors from this. So I think it's better just to get this to do the validation, and then we can retrieve the errors using a method called getErrors. So we know that we're going to need an errors property. So private array errors, and I'll default that to an empty array. And then we need to start thinking about the steps. What will this validate method do? What I'm going to do is just paste these in behind the scenes, and then I'll start to explain them. So these are those steps. I'm only going to cover the first 2 in this recording, and that is instantiate a reflector, so a reflector object using the new reflection class, and then we're going to loop over the properties. And I'm doing this to show you how you actually retrieve the attributes from the properties, and you use reflection in order to do this. So the first thing we'll do is we'll take the object and we'll create a reflection object using that. If you remember back to the reflection class that we did in the previous few chapters ago, we created a reflection object and we use that to be able to inspect properties and things on a class, on an object. That's exactly what we're doing here, and that is how you use attributes. So the first thing you need to do is instantiate a reflector, and if you remember how we did this, it's reflector equals new reflection class, and then you can actually pass the name of the class, or if you have an object, that's even better. We have a concrete object, so we can pass that instead. Okay, and I'm just going to import this like so. And then what we're going to do is we're going to loop over the properties. So we should be able to loop over the properties on this. But first off, let's just dump it out so you can see what I've been talking about, and it should all make a little bit of sense. Need to just go back to the attributes, make sure we're importing the right validator here. Okay, so we're importing that at the top. What we're going to do is instantiate this, call the validate method, which is the method which we just created, and we're passing in our user registration DTO, which is the object which you see here. We're then creating a reflection object using new reflection class, and we'll use that to be able to look at the properties, and you'll see here that we're able to look at the attributes on those properties, which is what is important to us in this one. Hope I haven't lost you. Just if I have, just leave any comments in the comments below and I'll answer them as quickly as I can. But also check out the code example which is going to be attached to this lesson. Sometimes just reading the code in your own time helps you make more sense than trying to follow me in real time, especially if your first language isn't English. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to say PHP attributes because we want to run that file. As you can see, something has been dumped out here. So let's go and have a look at this in detail. Here is our reflection class, and we're saying it is an instance of app DTO user registration. The interesting thing to look at is this here. So we have properties. So we're looking at the properties on our class, on our object, and you can see we have a username property, but then you'll also see that we have some attributes on that property. So if we look at this reflection attribute, and what it's telling us is that we have a attribute called required, which has been appended or applied to this property here, to username. If we keep going, we'll see we move on to our next property, which is email, and we also applied the required attribute to that property, and so you'll see that here also. And so hopefully now you're starting to see how this is taking shape and getting an idea of how this works. We're able to use reflection to identify the properties on the object, and then we're able to use that reflection object to also look at the attributes which have been applied to that property. And so this is very powerful. This is starting to give us some options here. So in the next one, what we're going to do is we're going to carry on working through these steps. As you can see, we're going to start looping over those properties, looping over the attributes, and then we're going to add some more custom code, some more functionality, which will be able to actually validate those properties which have the attributes applied to them. This is where we've got up to. We're in the validate method in our validator class, and we've explained how we're going to retrieve the properties of the object, in our case the object being the user registration DTO, and how we can then actually loop over the attributes of the properties on that object. And so we just dumped that out, and then here are our next steps. So I'm going to explain a few of them first before we start to write any code. So the first thing we want to do is we want to loop over each of the properties on the object, and then we want to grab the attributes for that property. However, we only want the attributes if they are of a particular type. So I've put a little clue in here, but we're going to come back to that in a second because it's not relevant yet. So we're going to loop over the attributes, but then, so say for example we have a required attribute, we then need to validate that. Now we don't want to put the validation logic inside of the attribute because that's not what an attribute is supposed to do. An attribute is supposed to provide metadata for whatever object, property, method we are dealing with. So we don't want a load of logic in there. We need to retrieve the correct validator for that rule. And so for that, I think what we'll do is we'll allow ourselves to retrieve the validator using a method on the object called getValidator. So that way, don't think we're performing a load of logic. We're just retrieving something which actually belongs to that rule, which I think will be fine in our case. But this poses another problem because there's nothing here to say or to prove or to enforce the fact that our attribute will have a getValidator method. And so this is where we come to attributes and interfaces. And there's a way in which when we call this property getAttributes method off the reflection property, we can specify, okay, we only want the attributes which are an instance of a particular class or interface. And so if we create an interface called validation rule interface, we can then enforce the fact that all of the attributes on that property, if they're implementing that interface, then we know that they will have a getValidator method. When we create that interface, we specify that the interface has this method. Hope that makes sense so far. So let's actually go and start the work on this. What I'd like to do is create this validation rule interface, implement it in our rules. So we only have one at the moment, which is the required rule. We'll implement it on that, and then we'll know that our attribute has the getValidator method. But we're not finished there, because in order to know that the attribute will have the getValidator method, when we go to call this getAttributes method, we can actually pass it some information to say, only give us back those attributes which are implementing this interface. Let's go and create that interface now. Now we already have a folder for validation rules, and so I think this would be the perfect place to put this. Validation rule interface. Namespace is app validation rules. We said that it needs to have one method, and that will be getValidator. Okay, and I'm going to leave it at that for the time being, but later on I imagine I'm going to come back here and I'm going to need to implement a type for what is being returned from this, but we haven't actually created anything yet for that, so let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's just make sure that our required rule implements this and that our validator actually has some logic in there to make sure that when we ask for attributes, we're only getting the validation rule interface. So we need to go to our required rule, and here we're going to say implements validation rule interface. I get the squiggly red line. If I do Alt and Enter, add the method stub getValidator. And so that's exactly just as I'm going to leave it for now. And we're going to go back to the validator class. So what we need to do is loop over the reflector properties. The way that we do this is like this. Reflector get properties as property. Then we'll open the curly braces. I'm just going to drop it down to underneath the very last comment there. Okay, so now we need to get the attributes using property getAttributes. So attributes equals property. You'll notice we have a getAttributes method on there. So I'm not going to put any filtering or any constraints in here just yet, which means that we should get back all of the attributes for that particular property. So let's just dump those out and then we'll apply the filtering logic for this. Let's go and run PHP attributes. Okay, so here you'll see that we have the reflection attribute, which is app validation rules required. Okay, so now what we need to do is pass some information to this to tell it that we want to make sure that we only get the attributes which are an instance of validation rule interface. So if we look at this, this can take two arguments, the first one being a string and the second one being a flag or an integer type flag, and that will tell this certain pieces of information, and one of the flags we can pass is instance of. I'll show you what that means now. So the first thing we need to do is pass a string which will be the class name or the interface name. So here, validation rule interface, and then it is reflection attribute, if I remember correctly, and then is instance of. So this is a constant, is instance of. It evaluates to the value true, but what this means is that when this getAttributes method is called, it will only give us instances of validation rule interface. Just going to import this. So simplify FQN, as you can see, that's imported at the top. If I run this now, in fact, I'll put the dump in here. But if I run this now, I expect the result to be the same because we implemented that interface in our required class. And so this is an instance of validation rule interface. Let's go and run this. Okay, so as you can see, we're getting that reflection attribute app validation rules required. How about if we went and remove that from the required class or the required attribute and ran it again? We now get an empty array because this is no longer an instance of validation rule interface. We've said here we only want the attributes which are a instance of validation rule interface. So we know that this is working. Let's go and revert this back and make sure it's a validation rule interface. Run it once more so we know that we're finishing with everything working. And then the next one, we shall move on and start to work through some more of this validation logic. Let's pick up where we just left off. So we're looping over the properties on our reflector object. We have the property, we're retrieving the attributes, but only the ones which are an instance of validation rule interface. What we need to do now is start to loop over those attributes, and what we're going to do is call a method on the attribute called getValidator. So for each attributes as attribute, open the curlies, drop the bottom curly just below the bottom comment, and here it says instantiate a property validator instance using attribute getValidator. So just ignore that, may use a different name, but what we need to do is call attribute getValidator, but it's not that straightforward. We need to actually instantiate the attribute first, and the way we do this, so we're going to get some kind of validator back, and the way we'll do it is we'll say attribute, and we're actually going to instantiate an attribute, because if we look at the required attribute, this isn't a static method, this is an object method, so we need an instance of this attribute. So attribute, new instance, and then we shall call getValidator off of that. Okay, and so I'm just going to continue here writing my client code, because I believe that once I've got this code in place, I'll know what other components I need to go back and create. So here, it's saying that we need to perform some validation. It's saying ask if the property does not validate. What that means is this: if validator doesn't validate, so if not validator validate, and you may have spotted a problem with this, but we'll continue for a second. What are we validating? We are validating the property value. So we are looping over the properties. We want to get the value of that property, but we also need to pass some information into this. We need to pass in the object which the property belongs to. If we go and look how we created our reflector object here, there's two ways of doing this. When you instantiate a reflection class, you can pass in the name of the class, in which case you'll just get information about that class only. But if you pass in an actual concrete object, not only can you get information about the properties, you can retrieve things like the values of those properties, because you actually have an instance. And so that is why we are passing the object in here. Okay. And so if that doesn't validate, all we're going to do is we're going to add the property name to the errors array. So if you remember the errors array which we created at the top, that's what we'll do here. But we'll not get to that yet. Let's now start to work backwards and see which parts we need. You'll notice that my validator has a validate method, but we're in the same kind of situation here where we could not guarantee that our attributes was going to have a getValidator method. Well, we cannot guarantee that our validator is going to have a validate method, because at the moment we don't actually know what the validator looks like. So I think what we're going to need to do is do a very similar thing where we have an interface. And so we are retrieving getValidator off our attribute. Let's go and have a look at our one and only attribute. So here we have this one method, getValidator. We need to return from this an object which has a validate method. So let's start to actually invent that object. I think what we'll do is, again, we'll go with an interface. So why not just call this validator interface? Obviously, this doesn't exist yet. We need to create it. So what we need to do is go and create an interface which has a validate method. So where can we put this? Inside of the validation folder, we already have a folder for rules. Let's have one for validators, and these will be the actual classes which are responsible for performing the validation logic. And all of these validators will actually implement this interface which we are about to create, which will be called validator interface. Okay, and so this will have one method simply called validate. Let's have a think about what this might validate. Well, this could be validating types of strings, it could be validating types of objects, arrays, all different types. So we need to keep this really loose, and so we're just going to say value. Let's go back, and we need to start at validation rule interface here and say that this is going to return us a validator interface, and then we need to go to our one and only class which is implementing that and make sure we are importing validator interface here. Now we don't yet have any validator interfaces, so we'll go and create a custom validator in the next one, but I think what we'll do here is we'll just make sure that we're getting to this point, and we shall just dump out some gibberish there, go back to our validator class, and in fact what we'll do is we shall just run this PHP attributes.php. Okay, so we know that we are hitting this point here, but in the next one what we need to do is we actually need to create a concrete class which will implement the validator interface, which will have a validate method and which will also be capable of checking that a value is not empty, because our rule here is to say that something is required. Okay, so at the end of the last one, we've got quite a lot of our functionality in place. If we look at our validator here, the actual main validator, the one which you pass in the object which is going to be validated, maybe should have called this something different to avoid confusion, but a bit late for that, I guess. So there's only one step left here. After we've done the validation with our validator object, none of which exists yet, all we need to do is just add the property name to the errors array. So first things first, let's go and create a custom validator which will validate our one and only rule which we have so far, and that rule is required. So really we're looking to see that the value is not empty. So inside we created the folder validators. In the last one we need to create a class which implements validator interface, which has one method on it called validate. New, and we shall call this required validator, because we are validating the required rule. Maybe required rule validator might have sounded better, but we need one method on here. This will be validate, needs to return a boolean, and so it's going to take a value. Remember, the value we said could be of multiple types, so we didn't type int anything here, but we just need to return not empty value. Okay, cool. So now the way to work backwards from this is to go to our required rule, and we shall return a new required validator. We need to make sure that this implements the validator interface. Okay, so my squiggly line's gone now. So it looks a little bit like a factory because we're instantiating something here. So maybe create validator might have been a better name, but this is okay. Another thing you could do from here would be to return a string representation of the class name and instantiate it in the validator class. But if you were doing that, think about it, we wouldn't be able to guarantee that it was an instance of validator interface. Here where we're type hinting the return type, then we're getting that extra layer of protection. So I think this is good. Next step is to go back to the validator class, our little mechanism here. Just dump the word failed to say failed validation. So we're saying if the validator doesn't validate this value on the property, then we should hit this point and we should see failed. And remember, the property that we are validating, if we go back to the very beginning, our user registration, so it's going to loop over both of these. So the first one we will hit should be username, and in the attributes.php file, we've left that as empty, which means that that should fail, but the email one should actually pass because we are providing something and it's not an empty value. So we will need some extra validation on that, an extra rule for emails to say that this is a valid email. But that's going to be a little exercise which I set for you shortly. For the time being, let's just run this and see what happens. Okay, so we hit failed. And in fact, let's dump out the actual value here. Okay, so as you can see, it's an empty string, and that is why that is failing. So now let's add this to the errors array. And for the time being, I'm just going to use a very generic message which will just say that this has failed validation, failing this validation rule. But what we can think about, and maybe something else which I can set you, or we'll do it in some of the other material, is we can actually have a specific message for each rule. So say, for example, the required rule fails, we can have a custom message for that. If an email rule fails, we can have a custom message for that, and that will be quite cool. But for the time being, we're just going to have a very generic message here. So this is what I've gone with. As you can see, I'm adding to the errors array as the key. I'm using the name of the property. Then I'm just building up a message using sprintf. And so if we haven't covered this in the course yet, I can't remember if we did or not, but basically can use these placeholders to create a message like so. And then the following arguments are what replaces the placeholders. So in this case, property get name will be username, and then attribute get name will be the required rule name. And then at the end of this, I think what we'll do is we'll just actually dump out the errors so you can actually see the errors. Okay, so as you can see, we have an array with one item. We are failing validation on only the username, and it says invalid value username using app validation rules required validation. We've now come to the end of this YouTube edit. I hope you've had fun. I hope you've learnt lots, and the attributes now make more sense to you. You know what they are, how to use them, and you've also seen a fairly realistic example of their use. I'm going to continue working on this over at garyclarke.tech in my Learn Object-Oriented PHP course. And I've got 5 or 6 things, a little list here of the things I'd like to add to this. And so I'll just have a run through these and you can see if it's something that you'd like to continue. So we've created the one attribute which was required, and we applied that to our user registration DTO. But I'm actually going to give you the opportunity to have a go at creating your own attribute. I've always said that the best way to learn is to have a go at things yourself, and there's lots of opportunities to do that in the Learn Object-Oriented PHP course. And so, yeah, you can have a go at creating your own email rule and its own validator, and then we just need to then go and apply that to the user registration DTO. And so that brings us on to the next point, because by applying a email attribute to the, or email rule attribute to the email property, we are then looking at something else. We're looking at how you can add multiple attributes to single members. For example, having multiple attributes on a method or on a class or on a property. And so that's another thing that you'd be looking at there. Then, if you remember what we said about the errors, all we've done at the moment in this validator class is we're just dumping out the errors at the bottom. But what would be nice would be to actually have a getter for the errors. So this adds the errors to that array, but to be able to just have a public getter where you can go and retrieve the errors, and then you could use that in a form or something like that, or use that data in a form. Let's go back to the to-do list. Okay, so create a getter for retrieving errors. And I'm also thinking of making this into a more fairly realistic example by having a form where we can actually submit that data, submit a username, submit an email, and then also maybe take the data from the DTO. So you'd be getting a full sort of look at how a DTO can be used as a carrier for retrieving that data from a submitted form, and then having another object or another process actually read the DTO and persist the data to the database. Okay, and then just one other thing, a very small thing. Someone pointed out that it would be a good idea to make the user registration class final. So I'm thinking of also doing that, and also adding an explanation of why that's a good idea. And so if you haven't had a look at final yet, or you don't fully understand it, then that's another thing that we'll look at. I'm just going to jump in here with a retrospective edit. So after that original recording, I actually thought of this. We've not covered attribute arguments, and I think this will be something which is important to know because the examples which I showed you included arguments when we looked at database tables attributes, and also when we looked at route attributes. And so I think what we'll also cover in the bonus material is we can maybe look at the username property and maybe have a length attribute, and so then you can pass arguments to them doing something like this. We could have like a minimum length of 4 and then maybe a maximum length of, I don't know, 30, and that's how you create them. But you're going to also need to know how we actually get at those values and use them to validate something. So I think that'll be pretty cool to show you as well, and I'll also include that in the bonus material. But for the time being, that's it. Like I say, hope you've enjoyed this. Leave any questions or comments in the comments below. I'll put a link to the Learn Object-Oriented PHP course in the description and also at the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day.